Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Women Who Invented the Sixties, Ella Baker, Jane Jacobs, Rachel Carson, and Betty Friedan, by Steve Golin, narrated by Allyson Johnson. Introduction. 4 Women. Rebecca Solnit wrote a short essay, 3 Who Made a Revolution, in 2006. The 3 were Jane Jacobs, Rachel Carson, and Betty Friedan. I was struck by her point that their most influential works appeared at virtually the same time. Jacobs's Death and the Life of Great American Cities in 1961, Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, and Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963. Working independently in separate fields, urban studies, environmental studies, women's studies, Jacobs, Carson, and Friedan made an immediate and lasting impact, transforming the way the public as well as future scholars approached urban renewal, chemical agriculture, and male domination. The 3 books seemed connected to one another and to the moment of transition from the 1950s to the 1960s. But it wasn't until some years later, when I thought of adding Ella Baker, that I became excited about a research project. Baker had fascinated me for some time, since I read Charles Payne's book about the organizing in Mississippi of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Baker added diversity. Jacobs, Carson, and Friedan were white, Baker was black, and sharpened the focus to activism. She was a lifelong activist who made herself an expert on how to build movements from below, and was the key person in the founding of SNCC in 1960. As I studied Death and Life and Silent Spring, I realized they too were activist works, intended to build popular movements for change. Jacobs wanted to stop the destruction of neighborhoods done in the name of progress. Carson wanted to stop the destruction of nature, also done in the name of progress. Friedan was a little different. She did not write The Feminine Mystique with the intention of building a popular movement. She did not become an activist in or a leader of the women's movement until 3 years after the book. Nevertheless, her book attacked the direction of historical change, protesting against the growing tendency to reduce women to housewifery. I began to see the founding of SNCC and the 3 books as successful interventions in history. The 4 women had different histories and trajectories. Ella Baker was dignified, private, questioning, profound. She was born in Virginia and grew up in rural North Carolina. She came to New York in 1927 after graduating from college. In New York, she became an organizer and a student of organizing, learning to distrust top-down organizations and leaders who were celebrities. When the student sit-ins against lunch counter segregation broke out in the Upper South in 1960, Baker was ready to turn them into a mass movement for equality in the Deep South. She immediately saw the need for a group of dedicated young organizers who would build from the ground up. She saw, in short, the need for SNCC and moved effectively to make SNCC happen, calling a conference of student activists and protecting their autonomy. Together, she and they created SNCC. She helped young people in SNCC become organizers by listening to them patiently and deeply. In turn, SNCC organizers listened to local people in Mississippi and helped them become leaders. Jane Jacobs was curious, playful, funny, down to earth. She was born in Scranton, a middle-sized city in eastern Pennsylvania, and came to New York a year after graduating from high school. In New York, she discovered her place, Greenwich Village, and her calling, to defend neighborhoods against so-called urban renewal. Falling in love with the diversity, small scale, and density of her neighborhood in the West Village, Jacobs became a champion of her neighborhood and of all neighborhoods. Top-down planning made cities better for automobiles and worse for people. Changing the direction of urban history was integral to her Death and Life. She did not want readers merely to understand how cities worked or why they were in decline. She wanted citizens to take pleasure in their cities and to make them more pleasurable, to reverse the decline. Rachel Carson was idealistic, transcendental, indignant, prone to depression. She was born in Springdale, a destroyed industrial town in western Pennsylvania. Whereas Jacobs enjoyed examining the wheels of locomotives in Scranton's train station, Carson loved to walk with her mother in the unspoiled hills outside Springdale. She loathed cities and avoided them as much as possible, settling in Maryland and Maine. She became a marine biologist and an author of best-selling books about nature, especially the sea. Carson deplored the destruction of the land by commercial civilization and offered the unspoiled ocean as comfort and cure. But in Silent Spring, she pivoted from flight to fight, making a direct attack on the spraying of DDT. In her quiet, reasonable way, she became a rabble-rouser, trying to provoke readers of Silent Spring to act, for the robins' sake and their own. She wrote because she wanted citizens to make a lot of noise while they still could. Betty Friedan was tempestuous, combative, hungry, ambitious. Born in Peoria, Illinois, she came to New York after college and spent most of her adult life in the New York area. For almost a decade, she worked full-time as a reporter for the labor press, covering strikes and other forms of class struggle as a partisan of radical labor. But when she was laid off, she suffered a career and political crisis. After a decade of not very successful freelancing, she wrote The Feminine Mystique, a critique of what American culture was doing to girls and women. She exposed the post-World War II consensus, women were happiest as homemakers serving their families, as propaganda aimed at reversing the progress of women. She was not trying to start a movement when she wrote the book. She was only naming a problem. Yet her act of naming would prove as disruptive as the interventions by Baker, Jacobs, and Carson. My book is about these four interventions. When Baker founded SNCC, 1960, and Jacobs wrote Death and Life, 1961, and Carson Silent Spring, 1962, and Friedan, The Feminine Mystique, 1963, they were protesting against the direction of historical change and seeking to alter or even reverse that direction. Baker did not think the Brown decision of 1954 would by itself improve the lives of black people. Only a mass movement of black people could do that. When she helped start SNCC, she was deliberately shifting the direction of protest away from the legal focus of the NAACP and the moral focus of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference toward a bottom-up movement for economic and political equality. When Jacobs in Death and Life and Carson in Silent Spring critiqued the bland assurances of the experts that a little destruction was the necessary price of progress, they hoped for nothing less than to reverse the direction of historical change. Friedan, in The Feminine Mystique, argued that the mystique was a kind of counter-revolution against the progress that women had made. She saw her book as a step toward restoring the revolutionary project of feminism. Baker, Jacobs, Carson, and Friedan invented the 60s in the sense that their interventions from 1960 to 1963 inaugurated a decade of radical thought and action. Defying the association of protest with communism that characterized the 1950s, they helped bring that fearful time to an end. All four women attacked the experts who promoted passivity. All four encouraged ordinary people to trust their own instincts. Critical of established leaders and institutions, including leaders of reform, Baker, Jacobs, Carson, and Friedan fostered a democratic upsurge from below. As women, they were outsiders in their chosen fields. Baker worked effectively at high levels of the civil rights movement, in the NAACP and then the SCLC, but was held back by top male leaders from exercising her full authority. Jacobs was treated as an amateur in urban planning, meddling in matters beyond her domestic sphere. Although Carson was able to become a scientist, she was barred as a woman from most field and lab work. Friedan knew in advance while writing that she was going to be ridiculed because she was taking women seriously. Being outsiders nevertheless gave them an advantage. They were able to question assumptions that limited the vision of leading men in their fields. They brought fresh eyes. They saw not only what was wrong, but new possibilities of change. They were good listeners. Baker listened to Marxist theorists in New York and to uneducated blacks in the South. Over the years, she developed a method of organizing that was based on listening. Carson listened to scientists who were concerned about the effects of pesticides and to bird watchers who were observing those effects. Jacobs listened to social workers, neighborhood people, and other activists, all of whom she gratefully acknowledged. Friedan listened, more briefly but crucially, to housewives who knew that something was wrong with their lives but were unable to say what it was. Part 1 situates each woman in the 1950s. Cold War anti-communism seemed regressive and repressive to Baker, Jacobs, and Friedan. The highly touted progress of the 50s was frightening to Jacobs, Carson, and Friedan. The highways, cars, and urban renewal, the better living through chemistry, the cult of the happy housewife. But they did not experience the 1950s as only a bad time. Especially as the decade went on, they glimpsed new possibilities. Baker experienced the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 to 56 as tremendously exciting and hopeful, and soon moved back down south to be part of the action, Chapter 1. In 1956, Jacobs began to speak publicly about cities. In 1958, she became deeply involved in a protest to protect Washington Square Park, Chapter 2. Carson, responding to protests against the spraying of pesticides in 1957, changed the direction of her work from celebrating nature as refuge from commercial civilization to attacking a major industry that was destroying nature. Chapter 3. Friedan, gathering information from the 15th reunion of her class at Smith College in 1957, began to develop a theory about what American culture was doing to women. Chapter 4. Part 2 is about their responses to the problems and possibilities of the 1950s, which I call their interventions. Baker seized the moment of the lunch counter sit-ins of 1960 to create SNCC, Chapter 5. Jacobs with Death and Life, Chapter 6, Carson with Silent Spring, Chapter 7, and Friedan with the Feminine Mystique, Chapter 8, intervened with books. Jacobs and Carson immediately became national movement leaders. Baker, who already was a leader, assumed her rightful place on the cutting edge. Friedan, 3 years after her book appeared, also became a movement leader. There were many protests in the 1950s, against racial segregation, against discrimination of various kinds, against economic inequality, against urban renewal, against McCarthyism, against the nuclear buildup. But the movements that took off in the early 1960s were qualitatively different. They were sustained, not momentary. They were national, not just local. They changed public opinion instead of being marginalized. Part 3 examines the bottom-up and democratic movement against racial inequality led by Ella Baker's SNCC, especially in Mississippi, Chapter 9, and the bottom-up and democratic movement led by Jane Jacobs and her neighbors in the West Village, Chapter 10. Rachel Carson turned the attacks mounted against her by chemical companies and their allies in 1962 and 1963 into a means of bringing visibility and focus to the emerging environmental movement, Chapter 11. Part 3 then follows the movements into the middle and later 1960s when they began to interact. The women's movement took off, a tremendous explosion of energy from below. Friedan became the recognized leader of one branch, while the more radical and youthful wing of the women's movement emerged out of and against SNCC, Chapter 12. Friedan wrestled with the young woman in the radical women's movement and with the consequences of her own celebrity. Jacobs, in her last American battle, was able to draw on a decade of radical civil disobedience, Chapter 13. The epilogue follows the women and the movements into 1970 and beyond. Carson was dead, but the environmental movement that she helped shape won an early victory in 1970. Jacobs's urban movement, in its struggle against building major highways through cities, appropriated a key idea from the environmental movement. Capitalism emerged as an issue for the environmental movement, and for Jacobs, Baker, and Friedan, each of whom reacted differently. Historians have grappled with the 60s, especially the transition from the 50s to the 60s. Daniel Horowitz's On the Cusp examines the micro-level of the Yale class of 1960. Horowitz mentions the founding of SNCC during their last semester and an article by Friedan months after they graduated, but acknowledges that it was not until later in the 1960s that the issues of race and gender emerged clearly in the consciousness of his classmates. He gets so close to his classmates' experience and his own that he cannot fully see the changes. David Halberstam, in the 50s, takes the opposite approach. Halberstam explores stirrings that led to the 60s, including Friedan's writing of the late 1950s, and succeeds in complicating the conventional view of the 50s. but he stands so far back that he is left with generalizations about forces that somehow came together and exploded in the 1960s. Fred Kaplan's 1959 takes the middle ground, locating 1959 as the pivotal year of cultural and social breakthroughs that prepared the upheavals of the 60s. Kaplan mentions Baker's founding of SNCC in 1960, however, by trying to analyze emerging changes not only in culture, but also in politics, society, race, science, sex, everything, he can only touch lightly on any particular change. David Farber, reviewing Robert Cohen's biography of Mario Savio, which treated Savio respectfully as a radical thinker and activist, reflects on the historiography that has expanded the 60s, including transnational approaches, and especially the long 60s approach, which stretches the 60s back to World War II. The aim which he shared was to put the 60s in historical context. When he taught, he would begin his course in the American 60s with the New Deal. In the review essay, Farber acknowledges the cost of this long 60s approach. We have lost the 60s. He wants to return to an older tradition that focused on the disruptiveness of the 60s, as Cohen's biography did, and to narrow his course to the radical 60s. Like Farber's course, this book treats the 60s as a time of radical thought and action. The book focuses on 4 interventions. It traces their origins in the later 1950s, closely analyzes their manifestations in the early 1960s, and explores their consequences in the later 1960s. What Baker, Jacobs, Carson, and Friedan did from 1960 to 1963 radically changed how people thought and acted. We are still living through those changes. Part 1. The 50s. 1. Ella Baker, Activist's Activist. A radical sense of equality. Ella Baker probably knew more about building movements from below than anyone in America. After graduating from college in 1927 in North Carolina, she moved to Harlem, where she learned from intellectuals who talked class struggle and from union organizers who practiced it. She combined class with race, looking for seeds of future uprising in all those excluded from power and status: blacks, workers, women, young people. Her whole approach was based on grassroots struggle and confrontation. She was immediately excited to be in New York, as Jane Jacobs would be 8 years later, but not for the same reason. It was not the streets or neighborhoods that excited her, but the ideas. New York was the hotbed of, let's call it, radical thinking. You had every spectrum of radical thinking. We had a lovely time. The ignorant ones, like me, we had lots of opportunity to hear and to evaluate whether or not this was the kind of thing you wanted to get into. Boy, was it good. As she listened, she decided what to get into. Listening was never passive for her, never opposed to acting. Early on, she waitressed in Greenwich Village near Washington Square. My first discussion on communism was from a Russian Jew. I would go down in Washington Square Park. I liked to smell the fresh-turned earth, and they used to plow up and plant new grass or flowers or something, and I was just standing there enjoying, I guess, indulging my nostalgia for the land, and he began to talk, and I listened. He wasn't too keen about the Soviets. He was basically approving the concept, but highly critical of the implementation of the concept so far as the Russian Revolution was concerned. In Harlem, she met other anti-Soviet Marxists, as well as Marxists who were pro-Soviet. And that was always food for me. I didn't care so much about the socializing as the exchange of ideas. From communists and other Marxists, she took the emphasis on social and economic equality, but rejected the authoritarianism. She was developing a radical sense of equality. Listening to Marxists during the Depression, questioning them, Baker developed an understanding of class that deepened her understanding of race. She was not going to be satisfied with helping talented black individuals rise to the top of American society. When I came out of the Depression, I came out of it with a different point of view as to what constituted success, she explained. I began to feel that my greatest success would be to succeed in doing with some people some of the things that I thought would raise the level of masses of people, rather than the individual being accepted by the establishment. Baker took a series of jobs to pay the rent, but her real work was organizing. Talking with radicals in Harlem and in Greenwich Village, working with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and militant CIO unions, organizing co-ops in New York and NAACP chapters everywhere, she was learning how to build movements from below. Organizing involved slowing down, getting to know people, listening to them, encouraging them to listen to one another's experience and tackle their common problems. Traveling for the Young Negroes Cooperative League, YNCL, during the Depression, she honed her organizing style. "It will be more than a barnstorming tour," announced the YNCL. "Miss Baker will spend at least 2 days in your community, studying with you your problems, organizing groups where there were none, pointing out from the experience of others what plans to make and what steps to avoid." From 1940 to 1946, she worked for the national NAACP as an organizer, and then as the director of branches, visiting local branches all over the country. Her emphasis was on organizing one's own community. When she went to Albany, New York in 1941, she was disappointed with the local NAACP for not addressing inequality in Albany's schools. The blacks who graduated from high school were all in a C-track, not in college prep. But the Albany branch was not concerned about that, hadn't done anything at all about that. In fact, they were always talking about the poor people down south. When she was elected president of the New York City branch of the NAACP in 1952, she moved the office uptown to Harlem and focused the chapter's work on challenging school segregation in New York. She believed in organizing around your own issues. That's where you could do the most, learn the most, grow the most. In 1941, she experienced the NAACP National Conference in Houston as deadening. After the conference, she recommended that the session used by staff members might evoke greater response from delegates if, instead of staff members making speeches, several delegates be designated to talk out of their own experience. The proper role of leaders was to help others find their voice. Most leaders emphasized their speaking ability. Baker emphasized listening, drawing people out, helping them discover their power. When she traveled to NAACP branches, her assigned job was to increase membership. You go in and speak one night and you have a big mass meeting and you say, "How many are interested?" And so you get the membership, but you haven't trained them. You haven't provided them with the strength to resist what's coming. To mitigate the NAACP's top-down structure, she created leadership conferences, actively involving participants instead of lecturing at them. We began having these regional conferences where people had dialogue and those in the so-called leadership roles were subject to questioning. In her bottom-up organizing, people developed a sense of their own power by questioning authority, including the authorities in their own protest organizations. Organizing in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, she subverted hierarchy. When she was organizing for the NAACP, she went where people were, whether considered respectable or not. Pool rooms, bootblack parlors, bars and grills. In Birmingham, she spent the morning visiting barbershops, filling stations, grocery stores, and housewives. She never looked down on people. In her view, an elite education could be a handicap, because you might imagine you were better or smarter than others. There was an NAACP lawyer whom she regarded as an exception. I think he was a Harvard man, but that wasn't in his way. He wasn't blocked by being a Harvard man. Subservience was no better than elitism. Walter White, the head of the national NAACP, often went to Washington. Too often. Unfortunately, he felt the need to impress government people. He had not learned, as many people still have not learned, that if you are involved with people and organizing them as a force, you didn't need to go and seek out the establishment people. They would seek you out. She was drawn to class conflict, especially when the labor struggle and the black struggle converged. During the 1930s, she worked with and was inspired by the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first black union to win recognition. This was one of the first, I call it, mass organizations that surfaced during that particular period. The NAACP had come into existence and had already been institutionalized. The Urban League had been institutionalized, but the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was different. To be institutionalized meant you might not be open to the new thrust from below. She was excited by the growth of CIO unions, which, in contrast to the established and institutionalized AFL unions, were aggressively organizing unskilled workers, black and white. The CIO began to send people down south, and you'd run across them, and frequently they found their only companionship in the early stages with somebody like people who were part of the NAACP. She met CIO organizers in Mobile when she was recruiting and fundraising for the NAACP, and in Newport News. "The CIO is moving in, organizing everything," she wrote in 1942. "I wish I could stay here several months. It is just the time to do a real piece of organizing for the NAACP, but as usual, I can only linger long enough to increase the membership by a few hundred and collect a few dollars." Frustrated in Newport News by the NAACP's business-as-usual approach, she took the opportunity to study mass organizing. "I am rushing to a CIO meeting." In 1946, she left her vice presidency of the national NAACP because it was too cautious, too focused on legal strategies, too afraid to risk confrontation, too top-down. She remained a leader of the New York branch, but she knew that merely ending legal segregation was not her goal. She was emerging in her own right as a leader of a vital current of radical democratic thought and action on the cutting edge of the civil rights movement, committed to the rising of the masses, not to opening opportunities for the black elite. What she learned in New York about class as well as race put her at odds with the national NAACP. Many times there are other groups, especially in the New York area, that are much further advanced in terms of dealing with social issues that affect the whole population than the NAACP, which was concentrating primarily on race. No longer confined by the NAACP model of organizing, she was free to respond to the new possibilities of uprisings from below. Montgomery. The Montgomery bus boycott of 1955–56 seemed to be that uprising. The poor people down south, so often objects of condescension, were in the lead. Here you have a situation historically unthought of and unpredicted, where thousands of individuals, just black ordinary people, subjected themselves to inconveniences that were certainly beyond the thinking of most folk. Where they would walk, old women and maids who ran the risk of losing their little income would walk, if they got there, rather than ride the buses. Now this meant you had a momentum that had not been seen even in the work of the NAACP, and it was something that suggested a higher potential for widespread action through the South. Could the uprising in Montgomery be extended throughout the South? The boycotts suggested that there could be a much wider extension of this mass-type action, which carried with it a certain amount of confrontation. Unlike most civil rights leaders in the 1950s, Baker welcomed confrontation. The challenge for her was, how does this get carried on? The NAACP was the only existing organization with local chapters throughout the South. The question arose in respect to mass action. Does the NAACP lend itself to mass action, or will it continue its program of legalism? The NAACP's preferred approach was through the courts, whereas her preferred approach was through organizing and confrontation. Court decisions, however favorable, become meaningful only as they are implemented by people making use of them. For Baker, the Montgomery boycott of 1955 to 1956, rather than the Brown decision of 1954, was the turning point in the civil rights movement. She played no direct role in starting the boycott and was as surprised as anyone, but her long-standing emphasis on uprisings from below caused her to value the surprise. Here you had a social phenomenon that had not taken place in the history of those of us who were around at that time. and she knew two people who had started the boycott. Two people who had functioned with the NAACP over the years, and they were Mrs. Rosa Parks and E.D. Nixon.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?